What's up, everybody? This is the Amateur Science Podcast, a podcast where a non-expert talks about science stuff. Before we get started into the episode, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I am a 25-year-old college student. I live in Central Arkansas, and I am a biology major. So science has always been something that I have been truly interested in, and there are some topics that I want to talk to you guys about. So what better way than starting a podcast? A lot of this stuff I have researched and wrote down a little script, and I'm going to do my best to stick to the script. So let's get into it. The first episode 1 of the Amateur Science Podcast, is about the history of evolutionary theory. It's going to be a very brief history. I'm not going to go very into depth with it. But throughout the years, humanity has asked the question, where did we come from? You know, as a way to explain where we came from, societies and cultures all over the world came up with religions, came up with, fantastical stories about, creation events and omniscient creator just creating everything in their image, whether it's one creator or 1,000 creators or however many. Because we really didn't have any scientific backing, scientific knowledge back then regarding evolutionary theory or where we actually came from. So it was all pure speculation and stories. It wasn't really until the 16th century, 17th century that a lot of these theories started to come to life. One of the first scientists to really come up with this idea was JeanBaptiste Lamarck. He was born in France in 1744, and he was one of the earliest proponents that acquired characteristics can be inherited by descendants, by offspring. There was a really good analogy on the episode about evolution of Cosmos, starring Neil deGrasse Tyson, where he talks about polar bears, brown polar bears and white polar bears, and how the white polar bears, they have a better way of camouflaging themselves on the white snowy tundra, so they have a better chance of getting the prey, so they will eventually end up overtaking and driving out the brown polar bears out of their environment. And this is basically survival of the fittest, or evolution by natural selection. JeanBaptiste Lamarck, he came up with this theory about acquired characteristics being inherited by offspring. A lot of his theories were later disproven, but this theory in itself laid the foundation for future evolutionary scientists to kind of build upon. And, everybody has heard of Charles Darwin. He is considered the grandfather of evolutionary theory. Charles Darwin, he was born in 1809, and his grandfather, I'm going to butcher this name, Erasmus Darwin, he kind of had some evolutionary theories that they kind of had, but he never really touched upon. Charles Darwin, whenever he graduated from Cambridge, he went on the HMS Beagle, and aboard the HMS Beagle, he served as their naturalist. He was in charge of, studying the natural environments of all these places that they went. And in South America, along the coast of like Argentina and the Galapagos Islands, Charles Darwin, he discovered fossils. And these fossils were of armadillos and sloths and other, mammalian creatures. And they were very similar to our modern day armadillos and sloths, but they had some slight differences that, that led Charles Darwin to believe, and later on in his book, The Origin of Species, write down that these fossils, these creatures that created these fossils, eventually transitioned from that species into our modern ones. So our modern ones are descended from these ancient fossils. When you hear of the name Charles Darwin, you most likely associate it with his finches. And these finches lived on the separate islands of the Galapagos Islands. And on every island had a different variation. This is what Charles Darwin mainly kind of studied and described was variation, based on environments, based on habitat isolation. These habitats, they were so isolated from each other, a finch would go over to one of these islands and be completely isolated from its own family. It's kind of like the founder effect, where these finches, they would start evolving and having all these different variations in their genes and their gene pool that would be exclusive to this this population of finches on this island. And Charles Darwin, he observed that. He observed that that some had stronger beaks, some had longer beaks, some had shorter beaks that better suited them to their particular environment. And the main idea from this, well, it was not really accepted mainstream in religious circles, which it still is not accepted in religious circles. Like Charles Darwin, he was a religious man. This kind of varied from the idea at the time that, everything is created in a God's image. So it's still not really accepted by a lot of people in our society now, which is kind of a shame because the study of evolution is very, very interesting, and I hope to get into the specifics of evolution here in a later episode. So the ideas that Charles Darwin wrote down, kind of pieced together, still really aren't accepted by a lot of mainstream society now. We have tons of evidence supporting evolution, and I hope to make an episode about evolutionary theory in itself, maybe in a longer episode. Since this is my first episode, I'm going to keep it kind of short. If you guys enjoyed it, feel free to follow this podcast, give me tips, give me feedback, give me ideas of stuff you want me to cover, and I appreciate you guys for listening. This has been the Amateur Science Podcast with Jacob Hansen.